Okay, excellent. Welcome to another episode of Conversations in the Open or Conversaciones a la intemperie. This will be the third installment of this semester series. And as we had announced before, we'll be dedicating this session to a book that I think that in all sorts of ways has been a sort of piedra de toque or a unset vortex for many of us that in the last decade or more, or a little bit beyond a decade, have been working in the threshold of modern thought and Latin American studies. Although this book, as we know, cannot be said to uphold or register itself in any of those autonomous disciplines. And that is precisely one of its untimely lessons. And of course, we're talking about Willy Thayer's La crisis no moderna de la Universidad Moderna, that was first published back in the days in the wake of the debates around the Chilean transition to democracy and the so-called Big Bang. And this is Willy Thayer's words, the Big Bang of neoliberal reassumption, along with the collapse of the state form and the vicarious or subsidiary nexuses of social and axiomatic administrative domination that defined Chilean society then and that have only extended its reach all over the West and all over the planet, one could say. And I don't want to say too much because we have quite a few participants in today's session. But it came to mind that some of us used to claim as a joke that perhaps Willy Thayer's La crisis no moderna, perhaps like no other book written at the end of the century, stage something like the co-belonging of the self-abdication of both the modern categories of modern legitimation on the one hand, and on the other, the ruinous function of critique, now tied to crisis, right, to decision, to separation, to alienation, within the watershed of epochal interregnum. So this, in a way, Willy's book is also a farewell to the modern epocality and also an invitation, perhaps an invitation to think another path, a path that today might be ex universitates or outside the university, and in subtraction to the heteronomic social forces of facticity, which Willy and also elucidated by the new translation that concerns us today, the facticity of the general equivalence, as explained by the translator Brett LaRue. But I'm sure that we will come to terms to some of these questions and problems that are very difficult and pressing for us today. And of course, we will do this in light of the new and in a way long due. Some of us a decade ago when we were participating in a conference about the university in Chile were wondering already then, when is this great important book going to be published, right, in English? Well, finally it's here, and we have to thank Professor Brett LaRue, excellent translation that was just published at the end of last year by Northwestern University Press. And I am tempted to say, I don't know if he or Willy would disagree with me, but now this translation could stand as a sort of last or critical edition, right? Insofar as includes not only a revised version of the 1996 text, but also the introduction also to the second edition of the Mimesis edition of 2019, as well as a learned and extremely lucid introduction to both academics and non-academics alike by Professor LaRue. And as usual, we have in this series colleagues and friends that accompany and carry the discussion. None of them needed any introduction, and some of them have participated in some of these conversations around books before. But just for the sake of procedure and norms, I will just list the names in the order of their interventions for today. We have with us Kay Jenks, who is professor of philosophy and Latin American literature at University of Michigan. Also with us is Port North, who is professor of German at Yale University, and whose most recent book is the new translation and critical edition of Volume 1 of Marx Capital. Felipe Teofanidis, who is a colleague and professor in some of projects that we have done together from York University. Sergio Villalobos, who is also a professor at the University of Michigan, whose most recent book is Asedios al Fascismo. And also with us, of course, Willy Thayer, and the translator who made this book possible, Brett LaRue, who teaches at Bucknell University, and who, if I'm not mistaken, is invested in writing a monograph about the question of institutions and pedagogy and transition in Latin America. So having said that, I appreciate everyone who is here today, as of course, Willy, for taking the time, and we'll begin the series of commentaries on the book.
So I want to begin by thanking you, Gerardo, for this lovely invitation. And I wanted to echo your comments about the translation, which is extraordinarily impressive. So it was really a pleasure for me to return to this book, or I'm not sure it's a pleasure. I mean, it is, but in this moment of crisis, right? And I'm in my first year of department chair, and so my comments really were written in the middle of this, well, reflecting this experience. So here they are. One of the most important ideas in Willy's book, which I understand had a particularly strong resonance when it was first published during the so-called transition to democracy in Chile, is his understanding of the Pinochet dictatorship as itself a transition from state to market, and I quote, the stage upon which the modern state subjects itself through dictatorship to abstract financial markets. Rereading the book in the current moment makes me think about what kind of a transition we are in today. Here, I mean, I'm thinking about the United States because I'm on the front lines of higher education right now. I'm thinking particularly of the dismantling of universities, along with the rest of civil society and the state itself by the Trump administration. Considering the current all-out assault against higher education in this country, I cannot help but think in a renewed way the extent to which the university, despite its shortcomings, its market-driven discourse and expectations, its fluctuations between what Willy calls soliloquies of the soul and its coquettish dances with funding agencies, rankings, and conflation of education as commodity and customer service, etc. Despite all these things, the university continues to be at once a place and the condition of possibility for unconditional questioning and critique. In our current moment of crisis, the precarity of thinking, or what Willy calls thinking inasmuch as it exceeds the performative limits of actuality, finds itself in one of the greatest states of emergency ever. It is as though we are living at the end of Borges' story, Plan upar in orbis tertius, in which a symmetrical structure with no linguistic difference, in other words, a fully global economy, threatens to take over reality, or what Willy calls a capitalist world turned imperiously planetary by a process of unworlding worlds. As at the end of Plan, we are confronted with the question of what kind of thinking or unproductive, infinitely finite, deuniversalizing transition might be able to defer and defy the apparatus, if indeed anything such thing is possible. I want to consider some differences between a moment such as the Chilean transition to democracy and the United States today. Maybe what is different today is that capital has reached a stage in which it no longer has any need of institutionally managed information centers capable of confirming value, distinction, or reflecting and justifying the sense of politics of consensus, as Willy describes the direction universities in Chile were heading in the late 1990s. The Trump administration is slashing funding indiscriminately, not as it might have been in a different era, in a war against certain subjects that don't easily fit into a conservative worldview. He's not only opposing efforts to integrate what continues to be a deeply segregated society, and I'm thinking right now of the United States, and especially the fact that one of his final actions as president in 2020 was to commission the 1776 Project, which redefined history around patriotic goals and frames. He's not blocking funds for artworks deemed pornographic or studies considered insufficiently celebratory of US exceptionalism or free market politics. I mean, his administration is slashing funding for research on cancer, infant mortality, sports medicine. In the unworlded information society in which we live, there's no need for institutions, it seems, dedicated to pursuing knowledge, much less staging critique. In our contemporary culture of search, universities then are viewed as clunky and expensive search engines. Not only are they less agile and manipulable than commercial search engines, but they also threaten to change the terms of the search, to point out its biases and limitations, and even cheekily formulate their own searches. And on occasion, they interrogate their conditions and possibility. Indeed, it may be that Trump's attack against education may not be because he views it as extraneous to his republic, so much as that he perceives it as a threat. Willy considers how Kant's theory of the conflict of the faculties was poised to pose a threat to the technical workings of power. He describes the lower faculty of philosophy as a site that questions the limits of sovereignty, withdrawing questioningly from the arena of the actual in such a way that introduces an untimely intervention into it. This lower faculty creates, he says, a state of exception with regard to the language of sovereignty, disrupting its assumptions of communicability, self-evidence, and presence to self. Philosophy, architectonically, marks the limits of sovereign control, opening a space to make audible the linguistic limits in which truth and meaning of the professional faculties and government management are inscribed. It is an impossible, inactual task, that's Willy's word, inactual, to think, and I'm quoting here, to think power without power, to speak of language in language, end quote. Its mode is neither public nor pedagogical, but structural, to create a space in which crisis and critique are allowed to breathe, to allow a different sense of life, time, and indeed history to emerge. However, Willy observes there was already in Kant's utopian blueprint for conflict the promise of resolution, a model of redemption through reason and progress. The difference that the lower faculty of philosophy seemed to offer bore a structural similarity to the upper faculties, suggesting rather than critical difference and interdependence, a siloing of theoretical query, which has become particularly evident in the contemporary technical and market-bound conditions of the research university, in which all intellectual labor is measured by economic metrics and is expected to produce useful information to support the status quo. Willy's book arguably ends there, an epilogue, as the first edition of the book put it, to an epilogue to the conflict of the faculties, which was the subtitle of the original book. An epilogue to the conflict of the faculties, the impossible possibility of a time space dedicated to questioning structures of sovereignty situated in the depths of the modern university. The second edition and the translation into English lack both the subtitle describing the book as an epilogue and the actual epilogue, in which Willy describes the book as an apocalyptic Angelus Novus, staring at the ruins of the promise represented by the modern university and by critical thought more generally. As Pablo Yersun pointed out in an early response to the book, the apocalyptic tone in philosophy can be understood, like Benjamin's destructive character, as clearing space for new paths to emerge, and indeed, despite the epilogic structure of the first edition, such a gesture is already evident. The subsequent editions make this even clearer, albeit without fully letting go of a certain apocalyptic tone. To begin with, in the 2019 re-edition in Spanish and the translation into English, the epilogue has been replaced by two texts. One is a short chapter titled Pinochet's Signature, which addresses the specific historical conditions of the financialization of education in Chile since Pinochet, as well as the massive repeated student protests that have responded to it. Willy describes the student uprisings as, and I quote, affirmative uprisings of multiplicities that, and I end quote, that expose and denaturalize the dominant structures and discourses of the neoliberal university. He describes the effect of these uprisings as similar in a sense to the questioning of the lower faculty, as a gesture that undermines the focus on paternalism, profitability, and a capitalistic understanding of freedom driving contemporary education without producing its own technical program or script for reform. Its radicality lies in its insistence in a minor key on that which is beyond conception, a demand for change without a clear horizon. The afterword, or postfacio in Spanish, addresses subsequent protests, namely the affirmative uprisings of multiplicities associated with the Mayo Feminista, or Feminist May of 2018, as well as observations by Lupe Santa Cruz regarding the lack of reference to women in the first version of Willy's book. Willy acknowledges that by not mentioning gender, sexuality, and other differences to the modern university's anthropological, heterosexual, and Western framing, his book exercises a certain complicity with this framework. He describes an inclination to have written a different book, and that is a quote, to address this problem, although he notes, were he to do so, it would have to be done in his own way. And I quote, "The event of feminism cannot be reduced to merely problematizing one sector of the phenomenal world." End quote. It also requires a retracing of the interminable digest of that phenomenality, gesturality, handwork of man, and handwork of man and humanism. That was also a quote. He concedes that such a retracing would constitute the impulse of that other book he might have written, the other non-modern crisis of the modern university, understood as the non-patriarchal crisis of the patriarchal university. So, in other words, rather than an epilogue as such, he ends with kind of gesturing to other actions, protests, and impulses from within his community and his understanding, writing other texts, producing crisis and critique. In closing, I want to mention briefly another addition to the newer editions, namely the inclusion of artwork by Gonzalo Diaz, which can be linked to this sense of a retracing of the ideas in the book. In the Spanish edition from 2019, there are 8 pieces reproduced throughout the book. In the English translation, there's only one, which appears on the cover. The pieces by Diaz can be seen as visually translating the conflict of the faculties, staged as a non-dialectical encounter between grid and mark, point and void, ink and substratum, frontality and dorsality. I am sure it is not coincidental that plate 4 was chosen for the cover of the English translation. All of the pieces feature excerpts from a handwritten draft of the book, and the excerpt in this cover piece is from the section titled "Don't Reform, Raise," concerning Descartes and destruction. I understand this visual citation, nearly illegible, upside down and incomplete, as an appeal to a destructive character that is not a foil for self-justification, as it was in Descartes' case, but a clearing of space for the to come. I would like to think of this piece by Gonzalo Diaz as giving this appeal to the Angelus Novus mentioned at the end of the original version another turn, a turn that sees its own gesture as a destructive one in the most interesting sense of the word. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I want to thank Willy and Brett for a really beautiful book, beautiful as it was in Spanish, and also in English, changing some of the formulations, adding some that we didn't have before. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to teach it in a graduate seminar in the fall, which is going to be called What the University Was. And it seems like it should be a central book for that. I'm going to make some remarks which are sketchy and brief, but I think they follow on what Professor Jenks was saying. I'm interested in the word crisis, which is somewhat of a misleading clue in the title. The non-modern crisis is not the ancient crisis. It's not a crisis in the Hippocratean sense of a disease whose cure is so unclear that the doctor has to make a decision in absence of any criteria, has to decide one way or the other to save a patient who will otherwise die. The crisis here is designated in the title as a non-modern crisis, but really the non-modern applies to the market university that's coming in to take over from the modern university. So crisis has a strange status, and I want to investigate it a little bit. I'm going to propose that it's used as a joke or as a placeholder for something that we can't yet talk about. I think the word that Willy is moving towards in this book is subsumption for crisis, but the correlative to subsumption that would take the place of the correlative to crisis, which is critique, is not said. We don't know what that is. We don't know how to fight subsumption, especially if we're subsumed or our discourse is subsumed. So I'll say what crisis was. It has an ancient and a modern form. On one hand, the crisis is in the modern university already. The crisis is what Kant is proposing has to be addressed by the critique of the lower faculty. There is a crisis there, like there was a crisis in philosophy, the crisis of the undecidable moment between empiricism and dogmatism. There's something similar in the university. Which of the faculties should be the leader of knowledge? How do we decide what knowledge is? That's the crisis of the other faculties, which is solved by the critique of the lower faculty. But here we have a crisis brought on by the non-modern university. And in this book, in a sense, we're asked to decide between them. We are looking at the non-modern university, the market university, from the perspective of the modern university, as though we're stuck in the vocabulary of the modern university. And this 1996 Willy Thayer is saying, how do we get out of this? Where do we go? What vocabulary do we use? It has some elements of the ancient meaning. the patient who will die if the decision for one path or another is not made. Crisis there is a kind of undecidable situation. That seems to be what he's pointing to. We can't really tell yet, he says many times in the book, what to do, what is to be done. It's strange that there's not a lot of talk in modernity about crisis until Marx. The Enlightenment doesn't about this, for really one exception there, that is Rousseau. The Enlightenment knows criticism, but it doesn't seem to know this other undecidable moment. When Rousseau picks it up in the Emile, he says, we are approaching a state of crisis in the age of revolutions. Who can answer for what will become of you then? This is a famous line that rings down through the French Revolution and through theorizations of revolutions. L'état de crise is what he names there, and what he imagines is a strange historical stage, which is undoing itself. State of crisis, he calls it, which is of course not a state, but it has a kind of, crisis almost comes to mean stasis in modernity. So unlike the undecidable judgment, which has to be decided on, where the criteria have to be invented after the fact, the ancient idea of crisis, the modern idea of crisis has a couple of features following from Rousseau. Somebody announces it, a prophet like Rousseau, and the announcement and the announcer are usually quite unpopular. They're accused of being unreasonable. The modern crisis also, as Rousseau says, it goes without saying. Everyone acknowledges it tacitly, but something happens if it's said aloud, or maybe nothing happens. We see there's a crisis and there's no response. That may be worse. This is the modern crisis. You start to look around desperately for someone who can respond to it, who can contain or divert its consequences, qui peut prendre, but it isn't who will do this. It belongs in a theory of history broken into ages that even has an age of revolution, an age in which maybe the course of history is going to be diverted. It's untimely and speaks against its age. So in it is a different theory of history. This is the modern theory of crisis, a theory of history in which there's something chaotic working, even in a fairly stable progression of ages. Interestingly, crisis is a word that does come up once in Hegel's philosophy of history, not to mention in the phenomenology of spirit, because of course, still, or having no criteria is not dialectical at all. It seems that not until we get to Marx do we have a sense that every age harbors within it something beyond a contradiction, a seed of its future collapse. This is the modern understanding of crisis. In response to a crisis, you're supposed to, in the ancient version, critique or make decisions, separate the good from the bad. In response to a crisis in the modern version, you're supposed to probably work for the revolution, work for this change, go with the flow. It's not clear to me which version of crisis is being joked about in this book, which version of crisis, the ancient or the modern, is wanted, is being diagnosed. And this comes very clear, as Professor Jenks said, in this moment where we're having something like a crisis, but there's no critique is possible. There's no position from which to critique. There's no place for it to stick. In a sense, if you're taking away all institutions, there's nothing to decide on. And this seems to be the aim. So Thayer's crisis was what to call this, it seems to me. And there is some vacillation there. In some of the uses of crises in the book, the word crisis, where crises seem to speak to us, call us to an urgency, it seems to signify a teleology that failed, a historical structure that was bent on a certain purpose, and then the structure suddenly, for obscure reasons, breaks down and can't achieve its goals. And at that moment, what you have is called a crisis. But this is the modern idea of crisis. non-mind. It makes a real question for critical theory. What do we do? And do we need to have a crisis in order to make a change? There is another model that Thayer brings up in this book, and that I think is really important for English language readers, and that is something that haunts Kant here. The name for it is Nietzsche. The critical model, where a faculty would stand against another faculty and be making decisions on what counted as knowledge, is undermined by the genealogical method, which Thayer, I think, thinks is the only one that can really survive. The problem with the genealogical method, where you wouldn't have crisis and critique, you would have the opposite. You'd have something like a too stable present, a present that's so stable you'd have to go back and show its empirical and contingent origins. The problem with the genealogical critique is that it reduces everything that's stable and institutionalized to a contingency or a fact. And when you get to the market university and you get to market forces, the brilliant analysis in this book is that it reduces everything to a fact. There's nothing but facts and no position from which to judge, to categorize, to name, no place to take a stand. So crisis falters as the diagnosis, critique as the response. And I think genealogy, although it's more in line with capitalism, it does the same job as capitalism. It might be in league with, it might be already subsumed genealogy, because it also reduces everything to its facticity. There's no higher position. So I want to just say a couple of things about some later parts in the book where this is thematized directly. This is in chapters 9 and 10, the transition from state to market and categorical crisis of the university. The categorical crisis is crisis one of the categories we could use anymore? This is obvious to readers of the book. On page 107, he says, ultimately, this is a crisis of the category of crisis. This, you can see, is a paradoxical formulation. It's a corrosive formulation. It is a mode of deconstruction where you're inhabiting a vocabulary that you know you can't use anymore. And I think it's the most interesting part of the book. Something about capital and its relations that does not lend itself to the idea of crisis. Because for capital, quote, no qualitative value transcends the economic gain. And, quote, late capitalism has no outside. If there's no outside, there's no Hippocratic standpoint, there's no Rousseauvian standpoint, and even no Thayer to pronounce the crisis. It's more than an imminence either. It's something like an incorporation of all these tactics to the point of assimilation, to use the Marxian term that Thayer likes. This is, if it might be real subsumption, but it may also be a term Marx uses only once, absolute subsumption, in which it's no longer a matter of any outside whatsoever. If we can't count on collapse and we can't count on critical activities, we can say that what Thayer is recognizing here is the passing of the age of Rousseau, finally, calling the end to the age of revolutions. Since nothing is essential to contemporary capitalism, he says on page 108, none of these activities can make much sense. And I want to end with just a few points. Number one, without the modern university, crisis and critique probably can't be the operative terms by which we can recuperate or transit into anything else. Number two, these terms are in memoriam of the modern university, a memento mori snatched from a tomb. Number three, that means we probably can't talk about the modern university's collapse, its crisis, its modern or non-modern crisis, because its temporality is neither modernity nor antiquity. It doesn't collapse, it just goes on. We can't make a decision on its future because it looks like it's still saying the same thing. As Thayer points out, the conference on the future of the university never happens. Our problem is you speak about the crisis of modern education, as he says, and we're really talking about the total or partial inapplicability of these categories for the analysis and understanding of the problem. If we switch the terminology to subsumption, where the same unit, the non-modern university is the modern university subsumed, with all the same terms operative, we need to look for the opposite of subsumption. And that's the big question for me that Willy's book leaves open. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. So we'll start in the same thing, about 10 minutes and a couple of remarks. The first one will be, I've noticed we've been using titled professor. I'm simply observing the fact. The other thing I need to flag is that we're not talking from a university. Kate, I think you're in your office, but others are at home. And I feel it needs to be highlighted because we're talking about the problem with an institution and we're trying to assess that problem right now from outside the institution. I always liked the Spanish titled Conversation in the Open. It's translated in English, but in French, intemperie also means bad weather, storm. Conversation in a storm, and I think that's perfectly adequate for the type of discussion we're having. The other thing I want to highlight is I come from a university. I'm a professor myself, although I have no interest or relationship with the title professor. I don't recognize myself in that, but that's my working environment. The other thing I need to add before I move forward, because it will inform my comments, is that I'm a little bit in a unique situation in the sense that I've stopped teaching 2 years ago and I work exclusively for the union. That is the Union of Faculty Professor. In Canada, faculty associations are also legal bodies. They have the right to carry a collective agreement, and if the employer, that is the university, breach the collective agreement, we can trigger litigation or legal process. And before somebody thinks that it's a perfect solution, it's not at all. The collapse is also happening in our place, but my position allows me to see that collapse from a really, really close perspective. So of course, when Gerardo mentioned if I wanted to read that, I said, yes, absolutely, because I'm living this. The destruction of the university, and I might come back to that, takes a different name, and I'm assuming you have heard the label because it's used in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, I'm assuming likely also in the US. It's called restructuring. That's how they are calling destruction of the university, simply restructuring. Maybe we can go back to that. I thought the idea of structuralism, structure, destruction, restructuring is something that could be explored. So that will inform a couple of comments. Striking things for me, 3 of them, and that will be the gist of my intervention. Even intuitively, even as a student, we know something is happening to universities. The book by Bill Readings, and the accent is French, so I have English and French, but I don't have access to Spanish. I had to wait for the translation of this book to be able to access this book. But even as students, we know something is going on with these institutions, the university. One thing becomes really clear in reading Willy's book is that this crisis is far, far from being new. It goes back a long, long time, maybe at the inception of the idea of the university. We've heard already about carte, tabula rasa with the university. There is the Kantian inversion. After Pinochet, we have something like the neoliberalism crush of the university, which I didn't know about, but which predates what we're seeing in Canada. So this is a very important point. The crisis is not new at all. It reminded me of a small bit I found from Auguste Blanqui. Auguste Blanqui is one of the most famous French anarchists from the 19th century. Already in 1831, but in the time spent of Willy's book, 1931 is quite recent. In 1931, Blanqui was calling explicitly in French, nous demandons la destruction de l'université. In English, Blanqui was writing, we demand the destruction of the university. And I was struck while reading Willy's book because I see that this demand for a destruction of something that we call university, or the idea of university, even predates Blanqui's call, of course, in the wake of the French Revolution. So all of this, and I will come back to that in my third point, the other aspect that is important when we're talking about the crisis of the university, among my colleagues, there is an almost immediate reflex, and the same thing can be observed in discussion about the word and the meaning of community. When something that we value come under attack because it's being destroyed or it's collapsing, there is an immediate reflex where we are thinking we should go back to how it was before it was better, right? Right now, the university is collapsing, and I'm seeing a lot of colleagues trying to fight, not to destroy the university, but to go back to a previous status quo, right? I think this is a bit of an illusion, and it's an illusion that is exposed very well in Willy's book. There is no going back to a status quo where the university wouldn't be a problem. The university as an idea, and we may, in the continuation of the discussion, make a distinction between the idea of the university and how this idea is being settled or institutionalized through time in various forms. One of them we know right now in the US, I know it's even worse. In Canada, I would joke, we don't need Trump. The administrator in Canada are doing Trump's jobs without receiving any instruction, so it's even worse. But this is an important thing for me. We cannot simply weep, cry, and regret an ideal university that would have existed and functioned perfectly in the past. The crisis runs with the university. This will bring me to what will be likely my last point, and one of the most striking discovery in the book. And I discovered this piece in the book early on because, Brett, you're mentioning it in your introduction, and it's actually not even part of the book. It's part of a call for a conference about the impossible university. And in that call, which we find on page 18, we find this excerpt, which I will read quickly. The question about the possibility of the university returns with some frequency over the course of its history. In that line of questioning, the university event, and that's the key word, the university event. The university event appears compromised, as if its very existence depended on the question of its possibility. If this question comes from somewhere, it is from the university's customary vacillation between, on one hand, the conditions and contingencies that enable, equip, and enclose it, and, on the other hand, the desire, forces, events, and contingency that unconditionally dislocate it. And the final sentence, without this vacillation, the university event is eclipsed. And I thought, because we're facing dire times within and without the university, myself, I was looking for something to cling to, something to hope. And for now, I'm clinging to that. It seems to me, and while I was reading that, I was reminded of a very beautiful story that we find in the Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant. There is a story about a dove. The dove is flying in the air, and the dove is exhausted, and the dove is complaining about the air because the air is heavy, it needs to push against the air, and the dove comes to think, if only there could be no air at all, everything would be easier. And in doing that, the dove does not realize that what the doves perceive as an obstacle is actually the condition of possibility of its flight. Remove the air, which the dove is complaining about, and you have no dove anymore, and of course you have no flight. And I will end with this. And I'm wondering right now, after doing 2 years of crushing union work, and wondering why am I doing that instead of writing a book, for instance, I'm wondering if it is a mistake to try to avoid the crisis or to try to resolve the crisis. I'm wondering if the crisis is not the beating heart of at least of the idea of university, not the institutions, which are all problematic, but the beating heart of the idea of the university as a living crisis. And I will just put that on the table for the continuation of the discussion. Thank you.
So it is my turn now, right? Great. I'm happy that I was the last one because everyone says a lot of things, so my work's pretty easy now. And yes, I know I'm not sure if I have to use the professor prefix in order to address former intervention, but I will do though. I will refer to former interventions. I just want to emphasize a couple of things regarding this publication, and of course, congratulate Brett for an excellent translation, timely, amazingly timely, because not just the current crisis, but also because the book has a sort of a relevance in itself, a pertinence in itself. I want to emphasize a little bit the context in which the book actually appears and how this context is far from local. It's not just a question of Chilean history, right? We might say that the original event that triggers the transformation of Chile, that are precisely the condition of possibility for Thayer's book, are inaugurated by the coup d'etat of September 11, 1973. Precisely the point is that the book appears in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, in the context of the so-called transition from dictatorship to democracy. And the dominant discourses in this context were pretty much the discourses that embrace modernization and globalization as an actual, solution to the problems brought about by the dictatorship, but at the same time were discourses that emphasize the punctual, character of the coup d'état as an exception to the long-standing, democratic tradition of the Chilean nation, right? So the dictatorship were pretty much like a parenthesis, an interregnum, pretty localized, that was fortunately enough, overcome by the recovery of democracy, right? So there was a sort of euphoria in this context. And among the discourses that were critical of this euphoria, we might, mention Patricio Marchand's understanding of the crisis of the Chilean university, and somehow the predominance of euphoric discourse regarding modernization and the free market and so on. That was for him precisely the most nihilistic, symbol of the new times, right? Even worse than dictatorship. The idea that we were able actually to overcome dictatorship, but embracing this process of globalization that indeed, as Paul indicated, was pretty much related to the final subsumption of light to capital somehow, right? So in this context, right, Willy's intervention pretty much was a sort of a suspension of the euphoria, a sort of questioning of the automatism of this logic of temporality, a sort of question of the whole, spatialization of temporality triggered by the logic of transition to democracy. And from that, we have two important decisions. One is that the coup d'etat is not exceptional at all. Dictatorship is not an exception. It's just the last deployment of a history that is the history of violence, in the sense that history and violence, has a really problematic relationship, because every history is also the conjuration of violence. It's what triggers the possible of narration, and at the same time that the real transition wasn't the transition from dictatorship to democracy, but rather was the transition from the nation state to the global market. So it was a transition that actually Gerardo was pointing as a epochal crisis, an epochal transition that produced, the end of all narrative related to the nation state and to the idea of, fulfillment of the nation, right? And because of that, the book is not exactly a book that, is limited to the Chilean situation. It's actually, a book that actually shows that Chile is over. Chile as the project of a national country, a national community, is over. So the solution for that was precisely to name a situation in which the categories we use in order to represent the situation of crisis were not working any longer. And because of that, the notion of non-modern crisis, la crisis no moderna en español, right? And Brett, probably you have a lot of alternatives for that, but it's quite difficult to translate exactly this movement here, right? The non-modern crisis, I thought of myself, back in the time, I thought myself about an unmodern crisis. And I believe that I have read people saying unmodern crisis referring to Thayer, right? But the non-modern crisis, indeed, is the total annulation of the possibility of the critical distance. And in that sense, Paul was pointing precisely to that. It's the total annulation of critical distance because the flexibility of contemporary university, contemporary curriculum within the market implies precisely the weakening of any possible hierarchy, any possible hegemony, any possible paradigmatic representation of the world. We were in a context in which the very flexibility of the contemporary university incorporate everything in a context in which there is no hegemony. There is no a principle to which articulate critical positions. So that's exactly what, for example, people like Jameson call a crisis of historicity, right? A crisis of referentiality, a crisis of the critical distance, right? So this unmodern crisis happened to the university, but not just to the university, indeed, right? It happened to the university, but because in the university it proved two things. In the empirical level, it proved that the modernization of the curriculum and the very modernization of the university was precisely a strategy that the university took in order to adapt itself to the new demands of the global market. So we call it Plan Brunner, but in Europe it was called Plan Bologna, and it's exactly as you said, Philip, it's a constant restructuration. It's a constant restructuration that actually in Spanish we call rationalization. Rationalization, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing, right? So, but this is at the level of empirical transformations. In the more complex level, what we have here is precisely what Willy called the end of the capitalist idealist end of division of labor. That is to say, the exhaustion of the critical distance that is also the exhaustion of intellectual work. And this is one of the most problematic things, because what actually means the exhaustion of intellectual work, which is the exhaustion of criticism and so on, right? It implies, the disarticulation of the modern relation between theory and praxis, but also at the same time, it implies a reformulation not only of the question of university, of the question of criticism, of the question of crisis, indeed, right? It is a non-modern crisis because there is no a new categorical institution that is able to reconfigure, right? And as a non-modern crisis, it suspends the very logic of the university, which is always the logic of managing the crisis, right? Managing the crisis. The crisis is exactly the heart of the university, right? But the non-modern crisis is the exhaustion of the possibility to, overcome the crisis, right? So we somehow transition into a sort of a facticity without critical distance, right? So in this context, right, the question is how to think critical work, how to seal the intellectual work. And if you think carefully this, what Thayer called the capitalist idealist end of the division of labor, which is not the division of labor was Marx was thinking in the German ideology, right? The division of labor will end as communism, right? This is an end of the division of labor, but it's an end that actually doesn't lead to communism. It leads to, facticity and so on, right? So how to think there, right? And probably the most important thing here will be that if we have a new relation to the crisis, a new relation that implies, the weakening of critical strategies, therefore we have necessarily to rethink what we understand by politics. Because politics cannot, keep going and doing exactly the same thing as usual, right? So it was already a clear intervention in this sort of folding process that demands from intellectuals and critical a rethinking about the notion of crisis, about the notion of critic, and about the notion of the relationship between theory and praxis and politics, right? No wonder then that the book is thematizing something that the other September 11, the September 11 of 2001, makes even more, evident. Not now in the Chilean context, but actually in the global context. The total exhaustion, of the multicultural agenda of the first, liberal administrations or neoliberal administration of the post-war period, right? The post-war period. So the fact that the book appeared now in the context of the crisis that Kay was speaking at the very beginning of her intervention, again, shows that we haven't been able to deal with the question of the exhaustion of criticism, of modern criticism. We haven't been able to speak about the exhaustion of the theoretical, articulation of hegemonic paradigms. We haven't been actually, able to resolve, to overcome the situation because the reach, the scope of this non-modern crisis, right, understood as a total subsumption, right, implies that the impossibility to resort to the tradition or to the tools of the traditional critical, practices. So we are there, but then the book could be written two different ways: as a nihilistic dismissal of any critical attempt, or as a serious and responsible, call to attention to a facticity that actually demands more critical work. And in that sense, the second edition in Chile, right, and the opening to the question of the student movement seems to me, crucial because it opened to a consideration of what actually could be thought regarding the question of multiplicity or plurality. I will prefer the notion plurality, less Deleuzian or less Negri, and more Arendtian, right? The question of a plurality as an affirmation of, of the politic as not as a competition for power, but actually as an affirmation of life, right? Affirmation of life. So what will be precisely to sync the opening of the book in the second edition and translation to the question of the student revolts regarding the question of a no conventional, no hegemonic, no principal politics, but a politics of plurality or multiplicity that cannot be just subordinated to, master discourses, university discourses, and so on. Right? This is in general, without negating the idea that the university is also heterogeneous and a complex place in which there are many fights, and actually we're in a really dark time, and we probably will be confronting really, really, really important issues in the next years. So that would be my comment. Thank you.
Okay, well, there's a lot on the table and truly powerful and enlightened commentaries by everyone. And before we open it up to discussions and exchange, then we'll hear from Willy and Brett, whoever wants to jump in and respond to some of the things that have been said.
¿Me? ¿O yo? ¿O Brett?
¿Quieres el contexto de la traducción? Podríamos empezar por allí. Después, Willy, puedes tomar las riendas de la conversación porque hay mucho sobre la mesa. So, Gerardo, thank you so much for this invitation. Thanks to all of you for the time in reading and rereading Willy's book, this time in the translation that just recently published. I can speak a little bit to the context, and it really does have to do kind of picking up with Sergio where you left off, right? And Kate, where you pointed at the beginning to those novelties in the re-edition from 2019 with the 2011 student protest movements, and really the cycle of protests that led from beginning from 2006, coming to 2011, and then ultimately in 2019, when the book finally was published and in print. And I remember, it was just after that, the first sort of roundtables about this text, even though a lot of the work, I think, it seems like was done more in the context of the Mayo Feminista of 2018. And that sort of political context is really what brought me to the text. I began graduate studies in 2011, and a first paper that I wrote basically asking one of the questions that I think is central to this text: can change be thought in terms anterior to the event? Had brought me to Willy's text, the 1996 edition, because of course the reedition hadn't come out in 2019. And it was the reedition in 2019, which is different in all the ways, Kate, that you described, but also in other important ways that I tried to touch on in the introduction. I think I described the text as being more less reticent to name the present, much more invested in the sort of particularities of the history in its language, because of course I'm approaching this text as its translator, not as its critic, although it has been very influential and important in my own work. And I think the desire to translate this text is a very strange one, because it is an incredibly challenging text, and one that challenges precisely the discourse of the text itself. It's this work that's constantly unworking itself in this style that has been commented upon from the original roundtable that was appended to the text in the 1996 edition, to early receptions by Oyarsun and so many others. And in my first approximation of this, of the 1996 edition, I guess maybe the principle, Philippe, of politics that you're sort of pointing to, I call it the no way forward but through principle. I had no way forward except through this text and through the translation of it. So when the text was finally reeditioned in 2019 with Ediciones Mimesis, under the leadership of Raúl Rodríguez Freire and Mariluz Estupiñán, and it reeditioned, I should say, very importantly from a translator's perspective, because we are doing an infrastructural and a reproductive labor, a transculturation between different, not only scholarly norms, but also legal regimes, and different intellectual property regimes. When it was reeditioned in 2019, it was also reeditioned under a Creative Commons license. So it became available to translators in a different way, or became available to me in a different way. And I was able to reach out to Raúl. I think I discussed mostly with him, and then he mediated the connection to Willy. And then we set out on an adventure to translate this work. I don't want to take too much more time in situating this, but other than to say that I think there's another crisis, or there's another moment to, or another way in which this text is very prescient of our current moment, which isn't only the crisis of what I prefer to call infrastructure rather than institutions of the universities that we find ourselves in different ways, but also that crisis, Sergio, that you pointed to of intellectual labor that so many people have kind of come to under cognitive capitalism or immaterial labor. And that when it comes to translation has become particularly, or the intellectual labor or immaterial labor of translation, this kind of language work that has become so pressing in the last 3 years with the rise of large language learning models and artificial intelligence that may or may not be creating a simulacrum of knowledge, of language, speech. It's hard for us to tell because of the kind of theology that seems to inhere in the black boxing of those technologies, or that is being created in the black boxing of those technologies. So since I began working on this book in 2020 or so, 2019, and the present moment when it's finally seeing light, the work of the translator has changed significantly, and I think that while translation is happening all the time, constantly, in every moment, because of the nexus of or the expanding interface that we have with so-called artificial intelligence or neural networks. That also greatly impacts, as we all know, what the university is and does. And I think in addition to the crisis of the infrastructure of the university, thinking along with Thayer in 1996, right, the crisis of intellectual work, those do seem to be, and perhaps thinking them beyond the crisis in the through their total or formal or absolute subsumption, not formal, excuse me, real subsumption. I think that is, for me, a new horizon that's opened on this text, even in the brief time that I've worked with it as such. I'll leave my comments there.
Great. Willy.
Sorry, Philip, but I speak in Spanish now. Bueno, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias por recordarme el libro, ¿no? Porque yo la verdad es que no me siento muy confundido, digamos, ¿no? Con los comentarios, o sea, no con las cosas que están en juego en los comentarios, pero realmente pese a que he tratado de volver al libro, algunas partes me gustan, pero la mayor parte me expulsa, ¿no? No, bueno, tengo que agradecer a Brett también por todo el trabajo que hizo en solitario durante mucho tiempo, realmente en solitario, sin apoyo institucional, sin apoyo, bueno, sin conversación tampoco creo, ¿no? Por lo menos me lo imagino así, ¿no? Por lo poco que hemos conversado sobre esa historia con la traducción, ¿no? Nada, yo solamente, si vamos para retomar la conversación y cumplir un poco con la promesa bueno, de este pequeño evento, ¿no? De conversar sobre el libro, solamente y muy a la rápida, muy en desorden, digamos, me gustaría marcar algunas cosas que sí me parecen, o sea, importantes ahora también, ¿no? Eh, Pero primero una cosa general que creo que la tocó más insistentemente Kate, que tenía que ver con el tono, ¿no? Bueno, con algo que se remarcó, ¿no? En el momento del libro, yo lo sentí eso también en el año 96, cuando se hizo el lanzamiento del libro, ser apocalíptico en ese contexto era ser de derecha, digamos, ¿no? O era por lo menos tener una inclinación, bueno, sí, ¿no? Una inclinación. Era lo peor, digamos, ¿no? Ser apocalíptico. Y me lo dijeron, ¿no? Y me lo dijeron personas muy cercanas, ¿no? Muy amigas también, y además que yo admiraba mucho. Y hay una conversación en la edición de 1996 que no se editó, o sea, que no salió en la del 19 y tampoco estaba por lo mismo en inglés, por razones súper justificadas, porque era una cosa que tenía que ver con la editorial Cuarto Propio, ¿no? No pertenecía propiamente al libro, sino que era una cosa que hacía Cuarto Propio con sus libros. Pero esa discusión fue en un sentido muy dura, ¿no? Yo recuerdo esa conversación, que fue una discusión y la siento muy dura. Yo recuerdo solamente una cosa, ¿no? Que era donde yo creía que estaba como un poco apertrechado para sostener esta especie como de sin salida, que no era tanto como una experiencia de sin salida, ni tampoco tenía que ver solamente con la dictadura. Una parte importante del libro también yo la escribí eh, como una tesis para el doctorado en España. Eh, Sino que yo estaba tratando de describir más bien describir la cosa apocalíptica. Y esa descripción me produció una fascinación, ¿no? Sobre todo en la literatura, ¿no? En la literatura, bueno, algo había porque me gustaba leer textos o zonas de obras muy apocalípticas, o sea, había trabajado algo sobre la cuestión del Gestell heideggeriano, por ejemplo, pero no su salida, ¿no? Obviamente la subsunción real, la subsunción formal, formal y real, ¿no? Que fue un largo seminario por el Capital en Madrid con Gabriel Albiac, etcétera. Fueron cosas que me pesaban, ¿no? Y esa pequeña historia que hay al medio, ¿no? Del libro, como Descartes y luego la cosa alemana, o sea, la cosa francesa, digamos, y la cuestión humboldtiana, Universidad Napoleónica, Universidad Humboldtiana, dicho como sociológicamente se suele decir, ¿no? Y la cosa de Nietzsche, ¿no? La genealogía. Entonces, bueno, me acordé de eso en un momento, voy a volver al tiro, digamos, a lo del tono, pero voy a seguir en este desorden, ¿no? Ahí se va ordenando, pero claro, yo recuerdo que ese, ese choque, ¿no? Entre la metafísica cartesiana y la metafísica alemana, pero kantiana principalmente, o sea, la Descartes, Kant, ¿no? En ese pasaje que luego leí de eso de una manera que me impresionó mucho, ¿no? En el texto de Derrida sobre las pupilas de la universidad, ¿no? Que justamente se refiere a esos textos, no se refiere tanto a Descartes ahí, ¿no? Pero no recuerdo tampoco. Pero claro, de alguna manera se me hilvanó el primer capítulo, que lo sentía muy asfixiante, muy en el tono de la subsunción real y en el tono de una descripción. También que le cambiara el tono a la discusión. Yo pensaba eso también, ¿no? Que había que cambiar el tono de la discusión. Incluso creo que la primera vez que presenté ese prólogo, o sea, ese primer capítulo bueno, en Santiago, ¿no? En un encuentro, bueno, en una institución que ahora no existe, ¿no? Eh, claro, decía eso, ¿no? Cómo cambiar el tono de la conversación y poner ese tono también, el tono apocalíptico. Pero ese tono apocalíptico que yo pensaba que de alguna manera zafaba con lo de Kant, o zafaba más o podía zafar más con lo de Nietzsche en ese contexto, se me volvía adentro, ¿no? En el momento en que lo especulativo caía en la subsunción, ¿no? Sobre todo, bueno, en fin, no me quiero ramificar porque no sé a dónde voy a llegar, digamos, pero cómo lo especulativo, o cómo eso que los alemanes llaman, o en ese contexto llamaban ciencia, pero que era un principio más bien especulativo, por decirlo así, finalizado, ¿no? De pronto bueno, la dialéctica, digamos, ¿no? Bueno, se me volvía dialéctico al principio especulativo, ¿no? Eh, pero, claro, ese tono, volviendo un poco a lo de Kate, en la conversación del final se hizo muy notorio. eh, y hay un momento en que creo, no estoy seguro si aparece esa cuestión, pero tiene que ver con la figura del muerto, ¿no? De que yo sentía que Pablo y que Federico, no en cambio Lupe, estaban tratando de decirle al muerto lo que el muerto sabía del muerto, digamos, ¿no? Y en ese sentido sacándole, haciéndolo hablar, digamos, ¿no? No sé si se entiende ese idioma, ¿no? Hacer hablar al muerto es como eh, hablar uno por él, digamos, ¿no? Entonces me quedó muy marcado la deuda, obviamente, con las preguntas de Lupe. Y entonces ahí hay un punto que yo encuentro que es muy crucial, pero que no soy capaz de, o sea, se acabaría la sesión y no llegaríamos a nada, yo creo, pero yo creo que ahí hay un punto de paso atrás, por decirlo así, más allá de cómo haya sido empíricamente la conversación con Lupe, pero siempre me quedaron muy marcadas de alguna manera sus preguntas y sobre todo las faltas de alguna manera nos pilló en esa conversación la Lupe, ¿no? Nos pilló en algo, a los tres estábamos Lupe, Federico, bueno, y yo, digamos, y la Lupe nos agarró por sorpresa, por un lado que era totalmente relevante, como paso atrás, o como posibilidad de dar un paso atrás respecto de una subsunción real, ¿no? Sobre todo, o una subsunción absoluta, como decía Paul, sobre todo en el punto que marcaba Sergio de la asfixia de la distancia crítica, porque la distancia crítica es una distancia ocular. Entonces, o por lo menos yo la pensaba así, digamos, la distancia crítica y toda la estructura de la crítica y el juicio, sobre todo el juicio, tiene que ver bueno, sigue teniendo que ver con una diferencia vertical, digamos, ¿no? Con una cierta diferencia, una cierta verticalidad, y en ese sentido ocularidad, ¿no? O teatralidad, es teatro, ¿no? Entonces, es la estructura del teatro y es la estructura, bueno, de alguna manera de la masculinidad también, ¿no? Yo pensaba eso, ¿no? Y la Lupe estaba interrogando esas cosas a partir de, claro, de lo que yo seguí experimentando en otras cuestiones después, como la apertura a la tactilidad, más allá de que efectivamente la distancia, digamos, la ocularidad es una tactilidad y la distancia crítica también es una tactilidad, en el sentido que te toca por todos lados, digamos, que estás hundido en ella, digamos, ¿no? O se está hundido en ella, pero de todas maneras eh, no se pueden asfixiar las diferencias metafóricas, por decirlo así, o alegóricas, o sea, trabajar con la tactilidad es distinto que trabajar con la distancia crítica y con el juicio. O sea, ahí yo me fui un largo rato a Plinio y trabajé con Plinio un tipo de crítica o de crisis. Yo estoy contando cosas que realmente no sepan mucho para dónde llevan, pero recuerdo mucho que en la lectura de Plinio, en Plinio no funcionaba la crítica ni la crisis como juicio, ni como tribunal, sino que operaba allí un detalle de la diferencia y de ir hundiéndose en una diferencia o en una diferencialidad, respecto de la cual, por supuesto que se podía hacer una taxonomía, pero no era una taxonomía, no me acuerdo cómo era la cuestión de esa taxonomía, ¿no? Pero no era una taxonomía, era una taxonomía lacunaria y donde no había algo así como un principio o la palabra aristotélica sería heteronti, ¿no? O sea, un trascendente, una otra cosa que organizara esa cuestión como algún tipo de organismo o ¿cómo se llama? Bueno, de, mm, de jerarquías también, ¿no? Que asignara lugares, diferencias y jerarquías, sino que más bien era como un agregado, con todos los riesgos que tiene la metáfora del agregado, del agregatum, un agregado de detalles y que podía ser, eh, bueno, en fin, podía ser una figura muy catastrófica también, pero también podría tener una figura eh, o bueno, muy rizomática, por decirlo así, ¿no? Eh, respecto a lo que decía, no sé si te entendí, no te entendí todo, ¿no, Philip? Lo lamento, digamos, porque me distraje también en un momento con otras cosas. Estoy hablando en castellano, así que seguro que me entiendes mucho menos tú. Pero,
No te preocupes porque yo he leído haciendo una traducción por escrito también por acá, algunos puntos
vale.
centrales, ¿no?
Pero la cosa de la paloma y el vacío, era la paloma, ¿no?
El perro.
Es la imagen kantiana de la ligera paloma que cree que volará más rápido si vuela en el vacío. Eh, claro, yo estoy muy de acuerdo con eso de respirar, o sea, en ese momento por lo menos, de respirar muy profundamente en el vacío, en ese vacío lleno, digamos, ¿no? También es como en el libro sobre Kafka de Paul hay una imagen muy, muy bonita del lleno kafkiano, ¿no? De cómo abrir un espacio de respiración en un lugar en donde no hay nada más que, digamos, no hay ninguna posibilidad ya de respirar. Tiene que ver mucho con eso también, o tiene que ver mucho con eso, lo que yo recuerdo de esa atmósfera nihilista que construía el libro, ¿no? Que tejía el libro, que yo lo tejía, no sé si afirmativamente, yo creo que, no sé si afirmativamente o negativamente, ¿ya? Y esa sería una diferencia importante, porque negativamente sería con un estado de ánimo muy, muy diferente y también un estado teórico, por decirlo así, muy diferente que si hubiera sido una construcción afirmativa y más opaca, digamos, del nihilismo, ¿no? Digamos, sí, del nihilismo y de la cuestión apocalíptica, ¿no? Y de la subsunción real. Bueno, obviamente esta cuestión del ningún novum, ¿no? Y la dificultad del paso atrás, y que tienen que ver mucho con, por supuesto, con el concepto de crisis, como lo estaba, o sea, me siento muy cercana, digamos, lo que estaba diciendo Paul sobre la cuestión de la crisis y los puntos que marcó, ¿no? Que no alcancé a anotarlos tampoco, ¿no? Eh, la cuestión de la genealogía, no recuerdo lo que dijiste, Paul, de la genealogía exactamente, pero o no alcancé como a morder, digamos, o no alcancé como a agarrar el mordente de la noción, digamos, de cómo estabas abriendo lo de la genealogía. Pero la genealogía, de alguna manera, en Nietzsche, ¿no? Ese texto, sobre todo los pasajes, son una lectura completamente arriesgada, digamos, o sea, no, mi conocimiento de Nietzsche o sea, me refiero que bueno, no voy a hablar de eso, ¿no? Pero ese libro me impactó muchísimo, digamos, o sea, me pareció un libro absolutamente no sé, descomunal, como incluso me impactó mucho más que La genealogía y la moral, que es un libro que igual impacta, ¿no? Cuando uno cae en él. Me impactó mucho por toda esta cuestión de la lengua materna, ¿no? De cómo trabajaba la lengua, que no lo llama, creo él, lengua materna, tiene otro nombre también en castellano, pero él hablaba de esta lengua materna y de la madrastra universitaria, y de cómo esta madrastra universitaria es egoísta, por decirlo así, ¿no? Cumple una función. Todas las modernizaciones tienen este carácter están constituidas desde un egoísmo, desde una clausura, de sesgos que dejan caer por todos lados. Y entonces apelaba en un filo entre romántico y entre genealógico, y eso para mí era una cuestión como problemática, ¿no? De no caerme simplemente en una dimensión romántica de una lengua, ¿cómo se dice? Bueno, se me olvida la palabra, ¿no? De una lengua nativa, no sé cómo decirlo, ¿no? De una lengua primera, bueno. Y esta otra cosa que sería una lengua eh, bueno, tiene muchas dimensiones esta segunda lengua, pero simplemente esta lengua interesada, digamos, ¿no? Interesada o intencionada. Porque esa lengua materna nietzscheana era una lengua que estaba hecha de, por decirlo así, de un piélago de ruinas, y de ruinas y de ruinas de lengua. Por lo tanto, ya era solo la modernización la que la constituía en una lengua, algo así como una lengua nacional, o en una lengua soberana, que tenía el carácter de soberanía. De alguna manera son los que mandan, es el poder, son las gramáticas, y ahí, bueno, obviamente se vienen encima todas las gramáticas. El teatro también que monta, ¿no es cierto?, la misma gramaticalidad en la lengua, ¿no? En esta lengua materna que, claro, es una multiplicidad de la cual no podemos decir nada, de algún modo. O sea, como que siempre habláramos en la lengua madrastra, pero sin embargo está plegada, ¿no?, a una... Entonces, claro, no sé cómo se hundía todo eso también en el Apocalipsis, por decirlo así, o en la subsunción real, pero me parecía que, y con esto termino, Gerardo, para que porque a veces yo me alargo, o sea, siempre me alargo, pero claro, yo recuerdo que la subsunción real me jugó una mala, la subsunción formal me jugó una mala pasada respecto a esa lengua esquizofrénica en sentido afirmativo, digamos, nietzscheana, esa madre que era un diferencial, digamos, ¿no? Eh, Porque el capitalismo de subsunción real es un archipiélago de lenguas que solo, por decirlo así, o sea, incluso uno podría decir que es como la época sin época, ¿no? Está más en la subsunción real que en la subsunción formal, en donde de alguna manera todas esas cebras ya son, ya están destiladas, son destilados de capital, ¿no? Entonces, están en la subsunción y se me murió la lengua nietzscheana, ¿no? Con esa, en fin, son cosas que tienen que ver con la escritura del libro más que con los problemas, ¿no? Bueno, lo voy a dejar ahí porque...
Muy bien, excelente, Willy. Yo creo que nos queda un poco de tiempo para rebarajar algunas cuestiones, ¿no?, que han salido. Así que no sé si alguien quisiera intervenir o responder a algo. A mí específicamente, ¿no? Si quizás pudiera decir algo al respecto, un poco siguiendo la línea que has dicho, ahí que se ha abierto en lo último que decías en relación con la lengua, ¿no? O sea, pensaba en eso porque en un momento también, hacia el final bueno, el capítulo que se ha integrado, ¿no?, a la edición que ha traducido Brett de la firma de Pinochet, ¿no? Pareciera que hay obviamente no una respuesta propositiva, que sería elevarla a una idealia también eh, compensatoria y partícipe del nihilismo, ¿no? Pero sí llama la atención de cuando hablas de la cuestión de la revuelta, incluso no aparece, por lo menos en el texto de Brett, ¿no? En inglés no aparece la palabra revuelta, sino aparece la figura del estudiante en relación con la voz, ¿no?, y con el problema del lenguaje. Y me preguntaba, ¿no?, también pensando en la tipología un poco que organizó Paul, de esa secuencia de la crisis, ¿no? De una crisis antigua, una crisis moderna que pasaría por ese momento, digamos, de la legitimidad efectivamente política, ¿no?, que va de Rousseau a Marx. Sería el momento, yo creo que del marco de Koselleck, ¿no?, de esa especie de crítica constitutiva de la legitimación política, ¿no? Pero me parece que hoy en día, ¿no?, y ahí se conecta un poco con lo que sugería Sergio también, ¿no?, si, si no habría una especie de tercera figura de la crisis que estaría relacionada principalmente con el nihilismo y la lengua, ¿no? la relación entre nihilismo y lengua después del colapso de las mediaciones políticas, ¿no? De sus categorías, sobre todo de la separación entre forma estatal y autonomía civil, ¿no? Entonces yo pensaba también en un librito, ¿no? En un autor que era caro en Benjamin, Eric Unger, ¿no? Que en el año 21 publicó el librito de Política y Metafísica, donde yo creo que es uno de los pocos libros así, casi en el temprano siglo XX, que lanza una noción de universidad, ¿no? Y él le llama universidad metapolítica, ¿no? Pero él pensaba la universidad metapolítica justamente como algo como en éxodo y en sustracción de la arquitectónica institucional, ¿no? Que hoy en día pareciera ser que es lo que está bajo asalto, pero que también como una especie de trampa de ratón, ¿no? Se nos pone adelante como algo que se va a destruir siempre, ¿no? Pero justamente para luego estabilizarse, ¿no? Eso es una especie de la lectura de lo que me parece que ocurre mucho en Estados Unidos. Entonces, bueno, Unger pensaba que el problema era una retirada para, a partir de encuentros, ¿no? Y de un tipo, lo que él llamaba una especie de psiquismo de las lenguas, ¿no? Eh, podía sanarse y a la misma vez sustraerse de ese impas, ¿no? Arrollador entre la crisis del nihilismo, ¿no? Y cómo no abastecerlo, que es otro de los problemas que tú nos dejabas de reflexionar, ¿no? No estaba formulada mi pregunta, pero digamos una serie de ideas que se me ocurrieron mientras les escuchaba a todos.
Bueno, a mí se me ocurre decir una cosa mínima, ojalá que los inspire, pero, o sea que hay una parte en el libro, perdona que vuelva al libro, pero hay una parte en el libro que habla de eso, creo, que tiene que ver con las homonimias que se producen, o sea, con las homonimias en las cuales nos movemos a diario, ¿no? Y digo homonimias justamente porque, o sea, nos movemos a diario y naturalmente, y siempre estamos hablando homonímicamente. Por ejemplo, cuando hablamos de universidad, ¿no? Porque, ¿de qué estamos? Digamos, estamos hablando, me refiero, si estamos hablando de la universidad, en el caso de nosotros acá, por ejemplo, estamos hablando de una universidad neoliberal, estamos hablando de la universidad moderna, estamos hablando, o sea, todas las palabras cruzan épocas y no hay cómo hacer el trabajo de, de que no se sinteticen categorías de un modo de producción en otro modo de producción.
Claro, claro.
O sea, que no se le cuelen las categorías que funcionan en un modo de producción a otro modo, por ejemplo, lo digo un poco a lo Benjamin, ¿no? Que no se nos cuelen las categorías de la pintura para aplicarlas al cine, ¿no? O las categorías del cine para aplicarlas al teatro, o las categorías de la universidad moderna para aplicarlas etcétera, o del Estado, ¿no? Hay un vaciamiento del sentido inmediato, digámoslo así, ¿no? Más allá de que justamente de ese sentido inmediato, bueno, en fin, el problema de la inmediatez es otra cosa también, ¿no? Pero en ese sentido inmediato, incluso en el habla conversacional, bueno, digo, en la conversación, ¿no? En la conversación donde uno supone que de alguna manera campea un poco la muerte de la intención, o sea que uno no sabe bien lo que habla en una conversación, ¿no? Pero algo habla y circula, ¿no? También ocurre menos eh, que, bueno, en fin, aquí mismo, ¿no? Nos puede ocurrir eso de cómo se nos vacía con la homonimia y cómo nos traducimos, ¿no? En ese, en esa densidad homonímica, que sin embargo no podemos, como que nos sustrajera la multiplicidad que está en juego en el intercambio, ¿no?
Ok, yo enfatizaría una feliz homonimia, no la que estás describiendo tú, digamos que el tráfico familístico, pero sí la homonimia que hay entre lo curioso que resulta el hecho de que la intervención de Lupe Santa Cruz no aparezca en la edición en inglés, ¿no? Entendiendo que Lupe es como una escritora chilena que precisamente elabora una reacción somática frente a la saturación homonímica de la transición, eso del lenguaje o sus lenguas, digamos, eufóricas, ¿no? Ella trabaja con la figura del vómito, de la saturación, de la enfermedad, para desarmar esa plenitud lingüística, ¿cierto? Y por tanto sospecha mucho del tono universitario, pero también del tono de la globalización, ¿cierto? El tono de la transición, pero que reaparece igual su gesto, porque reaparece bajo la figura de los movimientos estudiantiles. Yo creo que ese es la homonimia feliz, digamos, ¿no? Porque aparece precisamente la misma pregunta, ¿no? Que es la pregunta por una polifonía, o como enfatizaría más Adriana Cabarero, por una plurifonía, ¿cierto? Que se desordena respecto de la disposición axiomática o incluso heterogénea de las lenguas a disposición para nombrar el presente, digamos, ¿no? O sea, no hay una voz estudiantil, sino que hay una plurifonía de voces que rompen contra todo intento por capturar políticamente, críticamente, teóricamente, por neutralizar los movimientos estudiantiles no solo en Chile, ¿no? Como movimientos que responden a un régimen de historicidad distinto a cómo pensamos históricamente movimientos sociales, digamos, ¿no? Quizás yo creo que la ausencia de la Lupe refuerza la idea de que todavía está presente de una otra forma esa apertura que señala la Lupe, digamos, ¿no? Porque si no, claro, quedaríamos presos del inevitable verosímil que el libro produce en su descripción apocalíptica, que es la pregunta, ¿no? Que queda ahí, digamos, ¿no? El libro es tan eficiente en su descripción, digamos, que parece quedar inmanentizado a esa descripción, claro, ¿no? Entonces, por eso más que leer el libro categorialmente, se trataba de leerlo como un quiasma, digamos, ¿no? Me parece.
If I could just jump in very briefly, I like that reading quite a lot, Sergio, to read the book chiasmatically. But I'm curious what you make of the fact that in the afterword to the text, Thayer does cite the Mesa Redonda from the 1996 with Guadalupe Santa Cruz. And I'm curious what you make of that sort of gesture within the reading, maybe as a sort of opportunity to continue to open that reading a little bit more. What do you make of that gesture of incorporation, that long citation, block quotation, towards the end, and then the reformulation that Kate talked about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit complicated to speak about Thayer with Thayer here, right? But I will say that one of the things that is amazing about Thayer is that he actually recovered a very antagonistic position because he considered that to be part of the discussion, right? So he make a reference. I remember perfectly the observation of Oyersun and Galende complaining that the apocalyptic tone of the book wasn't able to deal with the real life social politicity or social politicization process that happened beyond the university, besides the university, and so on. And Yersun was, clever in showing that the efficacy of the book was precisely too high. It was so good that actually produced a sort of immanentization of the critical distance, right? But I think that if you consider carefully exactly the way in which Thayer is, on one hand, dismantling all the strategies that actually fit the modern strategy of dealing with the crisis in order to show that we are actually confronting a sort of a new kind of experience of crisis, right? So that by the reference to Junger, Erich Unger, Gerardo was just pointing, right? To the metaphysics of the Jew, the Benjamin's early writings before the critique of violence, right? But on the other hand, Brett, I think that another good point to think about this will be Thayer's intervention regarding the constituent process in Chile. You see, because you can have exactly the same kind of gesture. So everybody was so euphoric about the constituent moment opened by the revolts of 2019, and everybody thought that the new constitution will precisely resolve the problems that the former constitution didn't resolve. However, Thayer's position was it is not just a change of constitutions, to change one constitution for another constitution, one mode of production for another mode of production, one critical strategy for another critical strategy. It is actually to change our own relation to the question of a constitution, to change our own relation to the language, to the question of language and law and constitution. And that's precisely the point that demands to consider the intervention of the book always in a second degree, not just as a explicit theoretical position, because it's always suspecting about what the book itself is re-inseminating in the process of dismantling the present. So I think it's an open question still. I'm never sure if I make sense in English.
If I can quickly, I've been working for a long time with Gerardo, so Spanish is getting in, and it's easier from a French perspective also because it's really close. I think the last exchanges we have brings us back to a question which is at the beginning of the book and which was haunting me before we all met to discuss. The question was simple. How are we going to talk about Willy's book without talking universitarily, right? Without talking like professor, without using the codes and language of the institution? There is an effort in the book to do that. And Brett, we can talk about the what you have achieved in terms of translation. The style in the book is much closer to what I'm used to in French. Very long sentences, right? In English, they write really, it's all mechanical and technical for most, right? I'm not talking about James Joyce. But in this book, there is a flow and there is a tone that is something else, a style that I think should also be addressed. And that style, I will just propose that as an hypothesis, that style exceed or exist in excess of the universality language. And maybe there is a pathway out of the codes and the discipline. The other thing, obviously, I have in mind, and Willy, you mention it in the book, is Roland Barthes, his inaugurate discourse when he took the chair in literary semiology. And the beginning of that speech is very provocative. Barthes says, all language itself is in its own essence is fascist. And he poses an almost unsurmountable problem because on the other hand, we know that traditionally human being is described as the animal that has language. So how can I exist as a human being without being fascist? That's basically the question Roland Barthes is asking. And the answer actually is not mysterious and comes quickly. He will say art, literature, poetry. That's how you escape the risk of talking about power while using the power of language. That's the pathway out. So this is something that I hope will keep haunting me after this discussion also. How can I speak without falling back in the institution from which I try to distance myself?
Nice, because Barthes also speak about the anarchy of the phonema as opposition to the process of permanent grammatization, indeed. Yeah.
Maybe by way of coming to an end, I could ask Willy, almost 30 years later, how do you feel if the university has changed and what would you write now?
Bueno, igual te puedo decir algo, un poco, ¿no? Pero estoy escribiendo algo muy raro porque no he podido dejar de escribir algo sobre la cosa universitaria, aunque me dejó interesar, digamos, el tema, el asunto universidad, más allá de que, nada, lo vive cotidianamente, ¿no? Desde su lugar, ¿no? El lugar mío igual tiene una parte que me gusta y que tiene que ver con los estudiantes y con no sé, bueno, habría que decir con la clase de estudiantes que tenemos, ¿no? Que es feo decir eso, pero en mi caso no lo siento feo. Pero estoy, claro, hace rato armando unas cosas sueltas que tienen un título, ¿no? Tengo el título y puedo decir una cosa mínima. El libro se llama Cabeza, o lo que va a ser se llama Cabeza de Rector. ¿Ah? Pero estoy trabajando literalmente con las cabezas de los rectores y de las rectoras también. Son muy pocas acá en Chile. Estoy trabajando con las cabezas particularmente de los rectores eh, bueno, que proliferaron a partir del año 81, ¿no? O sea, pasamos de 13 o 14 universidades a 80 o 70 y cambian mucho los rectores. Y es muy interesante lo que ocurre cuando asumen el cargo de rector. O sea, bueno, eso ocurre en todas partes, me imagino, ¿no? O sea, pues perfectamente se puede hacer. Esto es vendible, digamos, es exportable. El proyecto, no sé si será tal cual, pero acá por lo menos cuando se sacan las fotos cuando asumen el cargo de rector hay una foto. Y en la foto ponen siempre ponen un escenario. Y los escenarios son increíbles, porque obviamente que está el retrato de Bello, ¿no? Acá marca mucho, que es un retrato que no tiene nada, ¿no? No tiene ni escritorio, ni ventana, ni libro. Me refiero al retrato de Montbazán, del pintor, ¿no? Que por lo demás Bello lo mandó a hacer en un momento de relevancia, digamos. Ya estaba grande, ya tenía como 60 años, había hecho casi todo lo que iba a hacer y se manda a hacer el retrato, pero por afuera de la universidad, y lo único que hay en el retrato, por ejemplo, de Bello, que refiere a la universidad, es la medalla, que está más chueca, ¿no? Cae chueca que le dan a los empleados de alto rango, ¿no? Entonces, de alguna manera, muchos rectores y rectoras menos. O sea, hay muy pocas rectoras todavía en Chile, no sé. Además tienen un rol muy distinto a la Universidad Norteamericana, por ejemplo, ¿no? Probablemente a otras partes también. Pero acá son una figura, o sea, es como el eje. Entonces, o están referidos al retrato de Bello, muy lejanamente, o están referidos a algunas fotografías de Bello, pero en todo caso está referido a esta idea de que en el momento de asumir, tiene que haber un escenario, ¿no? Y el medallón, algún tipo de medalla. Y estoy trabajando con lo que ocurre con el escenario, cómo se escenifica la escena y eso da mucho rendimiento para también es muy divertido y es muy arriesgado, ¿no? O sea, me refiero a que publicar algunas cosas es difícil porque tan eh, pero sí, lo único que se me ocurre hacer es como hacer cómics, ¿no? Cierto tipo de cómics. eh, bueno, porque no, ya vemos, digamos, me refiero a que lo que ocurre con los rectores es más o menos lo mismo lo que ocurre con los o rectoras, que lo que ocurre con, lo- con el Congreso, digamos, con los congresistas o congresistas y con los presidentes o mandatarios eh, es como, es como los Gremlins, ¿no? Es como de pronto haber entrado en Gremlins 2, ¿no? Tal vez, ¿no? Hay algo pero eso también habla de una melancolía o de una cosa como un poco dinosaurica, que uno se quedó, no sé dónde se quedó uno, porque por lo menos en Chile nunca se ha estado en ninguna parte muy claramente, ¿no? No se sabe bien. En Perú sí uno sabe dónde está. En México probablemente uno sabe dónde está,
¿Los
pero
dinosaurios o los rectores?
no, claro, más bien son como esa película de los marcianos llegaron ya, pero en un mundo de dinosaurios, ¿no?
You're right.
Sí, pero en todo caso tiene algo, no es una, bueno, en fin, no. Estoy trabajando en eso respecto a la universidad y son cosas que me cuesta mucho publicarlas. Bueno, en fin.
Y que es muy hispano eso también, ¿no? Porque, por ejemplo, en el Prado está la famosa galería de las cabezas de los Habsburgos, ¿no? O sea, la monarquía de los Habsburgos en su plan divino de edificación tenía la idea de que se salvaban por las cabezas, ¿no? Entonces comisionaron toda una galería de cabezas de la monarquía, ¿no? A diferencia de, por ejemplo, la manera la manera del poder calvinista administrativo, ¿no? Que ya Tocqueville decía que estaba difusa en toda la administración federal, ¿no? En todo el patchwork de, digamos, invisible donde no hay cabeza, ¿no? No sé.
Bueno, claro, yo las he puesto en serie las cabezas, ¿no? Porque las puedo sacar de la web, ¿no? Las he ido sacando de la web, o sea,
Mm.
no, pero uno las puede organizar y son como cajitas de tomate, ¿no? Pero
Ready made.
se pueden hacer muchas cosas con las cabecitas, pero independientemente de eso, sí, no sé todavía qué significa cabeza ¿por qué tiene que ser de rector? ¿No? Creo.
Pues bien, yo creo que es un buen momento tal vez para dejarlo acá y desde ya agradecerles a todos ustedes y obviamente a Willy y a Brett por la publicación del libro, ¿no? Y bueno, no se ha mencionado nada, pero será muy interesante también ver de qué manera se lee este libro, como decía, como apuntaba Kate, ¿no? En este momento en Estados Unidos. ¿Quedará como un libro secreto o ilegible o llevará a un tipo de conversación diferente, ¿no? El momento sin duda es interesante para eso. Así que bueno, de momento lo dejamos acá y solamente recordarle a los amigos que escuchan la serie que nada, el próximo mes regresamos para conversar en este caso sobre un número especial que acaba de salir en Philosophy Today sobre el pensamiento de Reiner Schurman. Así que hasta entonces.
Bueno, muchas gracias.